Syria itself. I was one of the co-founders of the Select Committee on Homeland Security. And having served in the military, I'm not going to take a back seat to anybody about how to defend this nation or what we need to do. My record is my record on the defense of the United States of America. The first part of my oath of office is to defend the country against foreign and domestic enemies. And I want you all to remember this, please, that in 2009, when President Obama was elected to be President of the United States and took office in 2009, January, I was on the Homeland Security Committee at that time, and if you remember, there was a report provided to the Congress of the United States through the Homeland Security Committee about domestic violence in America against the United States of America, about radical groups who within the United States. That report was buried by the Congress and the administration. I tried to distribute it to as many people as possible, because it's an earful. It's an earful. I came out of the service and I lived in Patterson and joined the John Matt Post. One of my first assignments of becoming a congressman was my first real experience with refugees. Bill Clinton sent myself and 2 other congressmen to Albania, Macedonia, to see where the refugees from Kosovo in the camps, the refugee camps. These are camps that were supposed to hold 12, 13,000 people. They held 30, 35, 40,000 people. When I flew in by helicopter, I remember from Albania, having landed in Albania, flew by helicopter, you saw a sea of white tents. It was something to behold. Then when you hit the ground, there you are, there's all these refugees dispersed, families broken up. I remember talking to just about ready to talk to a cameraman from a news reporter from NBC that was on the trip. Not with us, but was following what we were doing. And I'm trying to listen to the guy ask me questions, and somebody's tugging on my pants. There's this little kid, got half of a sleeve on his right pants and cut up sleeve on the left pants. Soiled face, obviously a refugee from Kosovo. And he's talking to me in the language, and I had no idea what the hell he's saying. None. Until his uncle, and about 10 or 15 minutes later during the interview, he's still holding on to my pants. He said, "That's my nephew." He broke in English, he told me. And he's been looking for his mother and father for the past week. Most of the people we are saying, hold it, in this legislation when it passes today, are mothers and orphans and the disabled. And in order to come into the United States of America, you had to go through 13 or 14, we're going to make it announcement, a 14th and 15th step. To get into this country, it takes about 2 years, 2.5 years. So I'm proud of the fact that our speaker, Mr. Ryan, took the religious connotations out of the bill, which was being presented yesterday by the chairman of Homeland Security. So we'll put the Christians on one line, and we'll put the Muslims on the other line. Look, this is the United States of America. This is what I went into the Army for, to defend. Religious liberties. And not to go into, not to get involved with knee-jerk reactions. We know this is serious. No one has to translate it for me. No one has to tell me to watch television. This is a very serious business. I mean, I disagreed with the president's Syrian policy 3 years ago. But he's my president. He's my president. He's our president. But it's just too bad if you don't like the president. He's still, I mean, I don't like everything George Bush did either. He was our president. And I made the mistake of voting and supporting that if he thought that that was the only way to go on to win the war, to go into Iraq. I made that mistake. I didn't blame it on Bush. It was the worst mistake I've ever made. I made some. Maybe you are perfect. I'm not. And then I had to explain to my constituents who are 8-1, 9-1 against that. So I learned at Fordham University, Robert, I learned from my parents, if you can't stand on your 2 feet, if you're afraid, you know, that we sing in church on Sundays, be not afraid. You know, those words kind of mean something. I mean, they sound nice, very nice, melodious. What do they mean? I think that Mayor Cicilline, Congressman Cicilline, is a patriot. Not afraid to speak out on a lot of issues. Sometimes they're not popular. I'm sorry. But that's the job of a congressman. If you can't stand the heat, as Harry Truman said, get the heck out of the kitchen. Go into the living room. Sit down on the sofa and rest. I want you to give a great NIAF welcome to one of our own, Congressman Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Pascrell, who's been a great friend to me, and he's right, we have a kinship because of not only our heritage, but because of our prior jobs as mayors of cities. I want to really thank Bill and Congressman Tiberi for their leadership of the Italian American Congressional Delegation and for helping host and put together today's forum. And thank you to our panelists who I had the opportunity to meet, who I know are going to present and engage in a great conversation with all of you. I'm really delighted to be invited today to speak about our nation's response to the Syrian refugee crisis, especially in the context of our broader foreign policy goals. And I want to begin, of course, where I think every person in this room and every person in this country would begin a conversation about recent events, and to express my horror at what we saw, these really despicable acts of terrorism in Paris, and what they meant to us as Americans, what they meant to us as allies of that country that has been our longest ally in the world, and because of our shared values of democracy, freedom, liberty, equality. I think every single American was really horrified by the news. And our country, of course, stands with France and with the French people during this difficult time, and I know that we are committed as a country to do whatever it takes to do everything that we can to help bring those responsible to justice and to help create a safer world. These attacks, of course, remind all of us of the importance of keeping our nation and its people safe. And I see, as a member of Congress and a person with the privilege of serving, representing the great state of Rhode Island, that my foremost responsibility as a lawmaker is to ensure that we've done everything we can to keep America safe and secure. And this includes, of course, providing rigorous and robust funding to carefully screen every refugee who seeks admission to the United States and making adjustments as new threats arrive. The terrorists who carried out last Friday's attacks sought to strike fear into the hearts of innocent people around the world. They're hoping that we will respond to their brutality on the streets of Paris from a position of weakness and fear. And we cannot allow them to succeed. And we cannot, most importantly, allow fear to dictate our decisions. Since the start of the conflict in Syria, more than 4 million people have fled their homes because they are victims of horrific violence that no human being should endure. Women are raped, children are being enslaved, entire families are being slaughtered. And to date, the United States has resettled a little more than 2,000 of these 4 million refugees. Let me just repeat that. We have resettled a little more than 2,000 of these 4 million refugees. But in the wake of last Friday's attacks, some in our country and some in the Congress have proposed that we close our doors to additional refugees in order to make us safer. I believe that these suggestions are as dangerous as they are misguided. And here are the facts. 3/4 of the refugees from this conflict are women and children. And before they ever set foot in the United States, each refugee must pass a multi-layered vetting process that is conducted by American personnel, a 13-step process. This includes multiple high-level security checks, biometric screening, a mandatory in-person interview with the Department of Homeland Security, medical examinations, and a cultural orientation program. It can take up to 3 years, but typically between 18 and 24 months to complete this process. And unlike the refugees that arrive in Europe that are physically there, refugees to the United States who are accepted for refugee resettlement cannot actually come into the U.S. until this process is complete. And to give you some context, since September 11th, since the day in which our nation was attacked with the most serious act of terrorism in recent history, 2,174 Syrians have been admitted as refugees. And not a single one has been arrested on terrorism-related charges. 2 months ago, people can recall in this kind of heat of the moment about refugees, people recall 2 months ago, everyone was horrified by the images of a 3-year-old Syrian refugee, a little boy whose body washed up on a beach in Turkey after he had drowned alongside with his mother and his 5-year-old brother. These are the people who are fleeing Syria, mothers, fathers, and children. They are human beings in need of urgent assistance. And they're doing the same thing that any one of us would do faced with the same set of circumstances. And it is an incredibly cruel irony to equate them with the same terrorists who have driven them from their homes. When we look at these people and consider our response to this crisis, we cannot lose sight of the values that have guided our nation over the years. Following the end of the Second World War, the United States offered safe haven for hundreds of thousands of European refugees. And when Saigon fell in 1975, we opened our doors to more than 1 million refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. At this critical moment, if we turn our backs on those looking to us for help, we will provide ISIS, this hideous terrorist organization, with an enormous victory. We'll allow the terrorists to expand their reach and add new recruits by framing this struggle as one between Muslims and non-Muslims. This is a price we cannot afford to pay. President Ronald Reagan often referred to our country as a shining city upon a hill. And in his farewell address, he reflected on his work to resettle refugees from Southeast Asia, saying, "That's what it meant to be an American in the 1980s. We stood again for freedom." Now in 2015, it falls to all of us to decide what we will stand for. Will we, as President Reagan did, stand for freedoms? Or will we abandon our ideals and surrender to fear? Will we provide refuge to those fleeing unspeakable violence? Or we will instead turn a blind eye to the suffering of millions and leave them to fend for themselves? We cannot allow terrorists to change the character of our nation. The most powerful message we can send to the world at this time of crisis is to maintain our values in the face of evil and stand again as a shining city on a hill for the entire world to see. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to. Okay. Okay. All right. The Congressman has a few minutes to take a question or two, and we'll open it up before we get to our technical discussion. Anybody have a question to Congressman Cicilline?
Quick question, sir.
Yes.
What do we do with the refugees once they get here? We can look at neighborhoods like Saint-Denis in France, where the migrants come in and the low unemployment rates and the utter lack of jobs has led to a environment that is primed for radicalization. How do we avoid that here?
Well, I mean, if you look at the kind of history of our resettlement program, it's been very, very successful. And in large part, it's because, first and foremost, refugees are not resettled into a community unless they are welcomed into that community. And the work of resettlement is typically done by non-governmental organizations, religious organizations, who really work very closely with the federal agencies to be sure that that person is resettled has the support they need in housing and employment, school, if they have school-age children. But it really is work that is sort of taken on by very effective community-based organizations, and cities and towns and states that are not prepared to participate in that don't receive refugees. So this is really a partnership. And there are obviously resources that are allocated for it. The good news is that on average, a typical refugee becomes fully self-sufficient in 180 days. So it's really remarkable. I mean, you think about what many refugees have gone through and kind of the experience they've had. Maybe it's not surprising that they tend to be resilient and strong, but they become self-sufficient very quickly. And it's a great kind of public-private partnership, and we work, I think, these agencies, and particularly religious organizations, work very hard to really integrate refugees into the communities where they're resettled, and so that we don't create these enclaves that you see sometimes in European countries. Yes.
Congressman, do you have any hope of bipartisanship on this issue, or are we in such a political season, polarization on it is almost inevitable?
You know, I don't know that it's even a political season of polarization. I do think that there is some bipartisan kind of understanding of this issue. I do think this is a moment, frankly, where people have real anxiety and real apprehension after they saw what happened in France. I think what we have a responsibility to do is to understand that, to reassure people that we have a system that provides the greatest degree of security and safety to the United States, but also fulfills our obligation to the world as humanitarians and to kind of speak to our values as a country. I do think that we have a really good system in place for reviewing refugees, that's really the best in the world, the most kind of intrusive examination. What I'm fearful of is that, you know, part of the narrative of ISIS and all of this recruitment is to really convince people that it's sort of the Muslim world against the non-Muslim world. And if we play into that narrative and start to sort of become a country in which, you know, there was actually conversation about only Christians being allowed, I mean, things which are anathema to the United States, but it's the kind of rhetoric which I think can then be used to strengthen the hand and increase the success of recruitment for ISIS. So I hope everyone will sort of pause, understand that people's anxiety is real, and that we have to acknowledge that and reassure them. I think most Americans probably don't understand the process, this 13-step process. I think when they learn that, they will be much more comfortable with it. But this issue of refugees, we have the highest number of refugees in the world since the Second World War. This is a huge crisis all over the world. And the United States is a very generous donor in terms of responding to the refugee crisis. But we also have to do our part in terms of resettling individuals who are fleeing some of the most horrific violence you can imagine, and in many instances committed by the same terrorist organization that caused the violence in Paris. So I'm hopeful. Yes, sir.
Congressman, the process you described and the statistics were enlightening. How come none of this has been communicated to the American public? The American public sits there, doesn't understand what the process is, why it's going on, and with this anxiety, they can draw some really different conclusions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I wrote an op-ed for my local newspaper yesterday, submitted it, that lays this out. And I do think it's the responsibility of those of us in public office to really make sure people understand this process, that we share that information with people, because we have a responsibility to respond to people's anxiety, not with bad public policy, but with good information. I think most people, when they hear these facts, will be reassured, and we have to do a much better job, those of us who support our refugee program and think that we have a responsibility to resettle refugees, to share this information, because it's very easy just to point to an event in Paris and just cause a certain reaction. But you are absolutely right, and I hope my colleagues will do the same thing and share information about this, because I think you're right. I think most Americans are reasonable people, and if they knew these facts, would be much more supportive of the refugee program than maybe they are today.
One more maybe?
Sure. Yes, sir.
Directly, we're talking about the length of time and these 30 steps that are take place prior to their arrival in the U.S. Do you believe there's also an excessive time wait, especially when you're looking at an emergency crisis, humanitarian crisis? You basically say to people, yes, you are allowed to enter, but you wait up to 3 years before we actually resettle.
Yeah, I mean, there have been many of us. I was one of them who have been advocating for much larger numbers. There are international organizations that deal with the issue of refugees who made a country-by-country recommendation. They recommended 100,000 refugees that the United States should accept from Syria. I think we have a capacity to do more. It requires more resources and more personnel. But you're right. I mean, there are people who have been approved for, or who could be approved if the process were expedited and there were more people doing it, who could presumably be resettled in the United States more quickly, but they're languishing in refugee camps, sometimes in very difficult conditions. So this is a process which takes a very long time. It's hard to believe it needs to take that long. I think everyone wants to be sure the process is thorough and complete, and that we can, at the conclusion of that process, know that the person can be resettled safely and without presenting a danger to the United States. We have to make sure that happens, but we should be devoting more resources so that we can put more people through that process more quickly, so we're not leaving families who are appropriate refugees languishing in refugee camps. Thank you very much for
Okay, I am want to thank both David and Bill for being able to join us today. It always adds a lot to our NIAF events when members of our Italian American Congressional Delegation take time out of their busy schedules to spend a few minutes with us and share their thoughts on whatever the issue of the day is that we happen to be speaking at. The next thing we want to do is I'm going to introduce the panel, and when I introduce you, if you could join me up here, and then I will turn it over to our moderator and get started. So first I'd like to introduce our moderator today, the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the European Program at CSIS, and a good friend of a number of our board members, including Anita McBride, and that's Jeffrey Rathke. Permanent Observer of Italy to the OAS, Marilina Armellin. Deputy Director of the Middle East Strategy Task Force, Atlantic Council, Jessica Ashooh. The Secretary of the Italian Democratic Party in D.C., a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies, Giovanni Faleg. And an Italian program fellow from Brookings, Matteo Garavoglia. So, with that, Mr. Moderator, it's your program.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially to the National Italian American Foundation for this timely discussion and for the invitation to me and the rest of the members of the panel to participate. Thank you especially to Mark Faleg for the kind words. And I'm mindful of the time, which is short, so we will be brisk in our presentations and then look forward to getting into a question and answer session with you. If I could just set the stage a little bit by mentioning a few figures. They may be familiar to many of you, but I think they bear repeating at the start of this discussion. If we look at the migration crisis, which is largely coming from Syria, but also from other parts of the world, and we look at the effect it's having in Europe right now, this year, 871,000 migrants and refugees have traveled to Europe by land and by sea. 142,000 of those have arrived in Italy. And the largest number of these are people from Syria, but also people from Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, Nigeria, and other places. I would highlight as well that approximately 3,500 have died at sea. And Italy has rescued about 1,800 migrants and refugees at sea over this time period. Now, many of you have probably seen the news about Europe's attempt to respond to this refugee and migrant crisis by finding ways to redistribute, to relocate migrants across the European Union. There was an agreement to redistribute 160,000 migrants. Up to now, 160 of those have been relocated. In other words, practically none. So the magnitude of this challenge is enormous. And so that gives us, I think, some kind of a picture of what we're dealing with. I think it's also important to remember that Syria, which had a population before the civil war of about 22 million people, now there are 7 million people displaced inside the country, 4 million outside the country. In other words, half of the population of Syria before the civil war has been displaced or fled. So with that in mind, we have esteemed panelists here, and I would set a few questions that I think we're going to try to address today. First is about the challenge to the United States and to Europe as a whole, especially to Europe's institutions when it's grappling with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the Euro crisis, as well as the possibility of Britain exiting the European Union. The challenges to freedom of movement in Europe and to the Schengen Agreement. I think we'll also ask them to address the important role that Italy has played and is playing, both geographically and in its leading role in the European Union. We'll focus on the intensified discussion of refugee and migrant issues that has arisen after the Paris attacks, and the challenge to Europe of managing its external borders. And this all happens, of course, in the larger context of a Syrian civil war, and without resolution to that civil war, there is unlikely to be an easing of this migrant crisis. So those are the questions I would pose to our panelists, and now I will get out of their way and let them start. And I'll ask Jessica to go first.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, everyone, for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to talk on this very timely issue. Whenever we're talking about the refugee situation in Europe or the Middle East, it's really, really important to understand the conflict that's driving this refugee situation. Because if you just think about those numbers that Jeff just mentioned, when we talk about Syria alone, 4 million people. Even if every country, had brilliant refugee resettlement programs, it'd be very, very difficult to resettle 4 million people, which is why it's not that we should not resettle them, because we absolutely should, and we should do it quickly, and we should do it as efficiently as possible. But people are just going to keep coming until you address the root causes of these civil wars. And so, to talk briefly about Syria, people often forget what this conflict started as. And it started as a peaceful uprising for citizens who were dissatisfied and really feeling quite brutalized by their government. It started in early 2011 when many other countries in the Arab world were in uprising. And what happened in Syria was a group of children in Dara, a city in Syria. They wrote some graffiti on a wall that said that people want the fall of the regime. Those children were arrested by the secret police of the Assad regime, and then their tortured bodies were returned to their parents. So that's really what we're talking about when we understand why the Syrian people rose up against the Assad regime. Now, the way that this conflict got militarized was also by the Assad regime, because peaceful protesters were responded to with force by the opposition, by the regime. Assad also very cynically released known Al-Qaeda prisoners from his jails in an amnesty at the beginning of the conflict, knowing that they would return to the battle, and trying to force the international community into a very, very cynical choice between him and the terrorists. And that's really what the Assad regime's strategy has been throughout this conflict, is to eliminate any moderate or middle option. So when you look at the war and you look at the types of targets that the Assad regime and now its partners, like Russia, are attacking, it's primarily not ISIS targets. It's primarily the remnants of that moderate opposition and the people who would form the basis of political transition in Syria. And that's why it's so essential that American policy work to preserve that middle, that political middle that's going to be the future of Syria. So that's kind of the root causes. But even if we shut down that civil war tomorrow and had a peace treaty, people wouldn't be able to go back to their homes still for several years. I mean, the average length of time of displacement of a refugee in modern times is 17 years. So we really need to look at this as a long-term problem. You can't just keep people in camps for 17 years and think that they're going to go back, like flipping off a light switch. Their homes may be destroyed. Depending on what a political settlement looks like, they may the part of Syria that they came from may be under control of a group that they don't necessarily like or want to live under. So there's really a lot of consideration. So that brings us to solutions, which is very much what my project, the Middle East Strategy Task Force, is looking to do. We're a bipartisan effort under the co-chairmanship of Madeleine Albright and Steve Hadley, looking at how not only the United States can work better together on these issues, but also how the United States and its international partners, Italy and other European countries being foremost among those partners, can address this situation. Because again, when you look at the numbers, it's just staggering, and it really, really demands international cooperation. So and we often look at this problem from solely a security point of view, and while the security point of view is very, very important, the problems with the Middle East are much more complex than just security. It's a neglect of those other aspects of the problem that really got us into this situation in the first place. So in addition to security, you've got to look at matters of ideology and countering violent extremism. You've got to look at how to rebuild these very broken societies. After you get a peace treaty, you've got to have all of these communities who have endured brutality, sometimes at their neighbors' hands. You've got to find a way to for them to get accountability and justice so that they can live together again in a society. Economic revitalization is going to be extremely important. And then you, of course, have to look at political reform. So when we in the task force, which also includes on its board of directors Italian former foreign minister Emma Bonino, underscoring kind of the international partnership aspect of this project, we're results oriented, and we're just trying to see what's going to work and what we need to do as an international community to stabilize this situation. And when we talk about refugees, as I said, you've got to look at it as a long-term problem, and you've got to integrate, not isolate, as Representative Cicilline said. These are going to be productive members of society if you just let them. I mean, that's really a staggering figure that he cited, that within 6 months, refugees are self-sufficient. That's amazing. And if you, especially in European countries where you have aging populations and shrinking tax bases forming one of the biggest public policy crises, if you start to suddenly look at refugees as a resource, as people who can start businesses, who need to participate in the economy, who are a market for goods and services, and people who have talents and want to be productive, then suddenly you can start to see rays of light and rays of hope in a way that you may not see if you just kind of look at the numbers and the masses of people. And then finally, just to wrap up, there's the cost, the discussion of resources always comes up when you're talking about massive population issues like this. And I would just urge you to look at the costs of action versus the cost of inaction, because leaving people for years in tents is just a recipe for disaster. These people are not radicalized now, but if you want to radicalize them, leave them 12 years and say, sorry, there's no room at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Jessica Ashooh. And now we will turn to Ambassador, we'll turn to Ambassador Marilina Armellin to speak about the Italian perspective.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, and I thank NIAF for inviting me. But I'm also really proud to be here and tell you what Italy, what my country and my government has done so far for what is the most serious crisis we experienced since World War II in Europe so far. Human mobility is a complex phenomenon, and it has many causes, many deep-rooted causes. Political, economic, conflicts, but also demographics. Also climate change is a factor of human mobility. And so we require this phenomenon requires us to give answers at many layers, at many levels. And the first answer that Italy gave was solidarity, as back as 2013, when we single-handedly in Europe conducted the biggest humanitarian operation that we deployed, and that was Mare Nostrum, that permitted to save over 150,000 people in one single year, people who would have died in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean has unfortunately become a tomb for many people seeking shelter and refuge off our shores. We are now continuing it. You know that Italy is heading the European Union mission that was mentioned, UNAFOR-Med, even if it has a different scope. And in this respect, I want to come back to the figures that have been recalled here and that are staggering. 42,000 people arrived in my country, in Italy, just this year, so not even ending 2015. But Syrians are only the 5th nationality for arrivals. We had, and I want to give you the figures because they are telling us something more. 37,800 Eritreans arrived, almost 20,000 Nigerians, 11,000 Somalis, 8,700 Sudanese, and then almost 8,000 Syrians. So it would be an oversimplification to think and to believe that the large numbers of people seeking refuge in Europe are only fleeing the Syria conflicts. Unfortunately, there are many other conflicts and many other dire situations that put in danger human lives around the world, and that are often neglected and are often not on the first page of newspapers. Italy became in 2014 the 5th country to host asylum seekers in the world, after Germany, the US, Turkey, and Sweden, to give you the full picture. We have also a very high rate of granting asylum to people asking for it, because we on all the requests that we receive, on average we grant 44% of asylum to people asking for it. Also because we have different layers of protection. The fully fledged is the recognition of refugee, but we have also other kinds of visa that we can give and of resident permits that we can give in our country for humanitarian and protection reasons. Also to those people who do not qualify to be a fully fledged refugee. And as you know, refugees have the possibility to stay in the country forever until the situation in their, at least in their country, is declared safe. So that's why I was talking about answers at different levels. And therefore, the first answer was solidarity, but then I have also to come to the point that Italy also considers important to face medium to long-term answers to this phenomenon. Human mobility is the mega trend of the 21st century, and it is there to stay. It's not just one conflict, the Syrian conflict, or we have to face it. It's a fact. It's a trend, and it's there to stay. So the most ambitious challenge that we have now is to understand that international mobility is in the longer term an opportunity for us, an opportunity for Western societies who are aging, and we need to switch the political discourse. I know it's difficult, especially in the aftermath of what happened in Paris, but we have to switch our mind and shift from the panic mode that we are experiencing to a planning mode, because what we are facing, again, is there to stay, and we have to plan it and to manage it rather than to react to it in a hysteric way. So the recent migration summit that was held in La Valletta in Malta just last week on November 11th and 12th is a step in this direction. It's a dialogue between the European Union and the African Union on migration issues. So what we are trying to do, and Italy was during our presidency of the European Union, we were promoting very much this approach through the Khartoum process. So what we need is to step up and to strengthen our dialogue between Europe and Africa, and to focus on shared migration management processes and projects. We also need to address deep-rooted causes of conflicts, even if we know what a difficult task that is. And on this note, let me recall to all of you another source of pride that we have now. Just yesterday, our own Filippo Grandi was nominated by the General Assembly after the nomination by the Secretary General. He's nominated as the new United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And it's, of course, a great honor for Italy. He is an outstanding person, but I think that this nomination is also a recognition of the commitment by Italy in the defense of human rights and on the reception of those fleeing conflicts and fleeing persecutions through the very difficult Mediterranean route. So we are experiencing, as I said in the beginning, the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. That is a fact. But as we learned from our history, we don't want to push back people needing shelter, people seeking a new home and a better life for themselves and for their families. Italians went through war, Italians migrated. Now it is our turn to give hope, and we will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now we'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Giovanni Faleg to speak a little bit about some of the security and other aspects in Europe that arise.
Thank you. I realize you're probably all going to say the same things based on the previous two interventions, and mine is not that different. Not sure if that is a good thing or a bad thing. Good certainly, because obviously we realize that we have enormous problems, and maybe bad because discussion always help you moving forward with more concrete and more efficient proposals on how to tackle these problems. Now, what I want to share with you is really my takeaways from the trip to Europe I did last week. So I was in Brussels and in Italy until Sunday. And it was interesting. I mean, I was in Brussels for events on the migration issue, on the refugee crisis, before the Paris attacks. And while I was there, obviously, I mean, you realize pretty quick that the three words, the key words in Brussels for the past months have been migration, migration, migration. That was really what people will talk about all the time. Now that changed in less than 24 hours to liberté, égalité, fraternité. The political debate obviously changed very quickly, and so did the priorities for governments as well as for EU policymakers. Now, I mean, we do have a problem to discuss about change. Why about change, and what does change mean? The issue that we have about change is that as political parties, as citizens, we probably need to look ourselves into a mirror and recognize that we have done mistakes in the past 15 years to address some of the things that were mentioned, from root causes of conflicts, root causes of migration, root causes of terrorism. The instruments that we have used and the resources that we have dispersed in Europe were obviously not effective. We had, if you look at the European security strategy, 10 years or more than 10, 12 years ago, we were trying to build a more stable Europe and a more stable neighborhood. We end up with exactly the opposite scenario, not just outside Europe, but inside Europe. And so this is the first thing which changed. So recognize that we have made mistakes, besides what others, what terrorists, threats have done to hit us. And the second thing is that, and I think we can all agree with that, we can no longer afford to do the same mistakes or to be ineffective in our policies. Now, as a researcher, I tend to, write these things, and researchers write interesting things. Almost nobody read them. So, but as a representative of the Democratic Party, Italian Democratic Party, I feel that we have, as parties, especially as democratic parties, a responsibility to promote change for good. That's our moral responsibility. When we see that things don't work, we have to promote change. We have to tell society how to achieve that change. And I think that, and based on what is happening in these hours we have three main issues to tackle to define our path towards change. Now, the first issue is, and all of these, I mean, you know, I'm supposed to talk about security, I'm supposed to talk about Italy. I mean, I come to realize that now it all boils down to the same thing. There's no longer a division between security and the rest. It's all the same thing. The policies that we need to activate and the framework that we need to have are all-encompassing. They can't, it's multidimensional. It can't be just security, it can't be just defense. There has to be broader coordination with other policies. So, back to my point, we have three key dimensions to pay attention to when we speak about change. So the first one is how to stay united. That's a big problem in Europe right now. We have obviously expressed solidarity to France. We have activated the mutual defense clause to support France, not just in Syria, well beyond Syria, in other operations in sub-Saharan Africa and wherever there is fragility and possibly sites for terrorist groups. That's a short-term measure, and as it was mentioned before, it is all important that we find a way to actually move from these short-term measures, from this emergency mindset, to longer-term visions and to longer-term strategy. And we can't do that unless we think, we act European. And European means the European Union. So we have to find more effective policies at a European Union level to actually tackle these phenomena. If the European Union can't show to be truly united as a union, we will lose this war, and we will find ourselves in 10 years with a more messed up neighborhood and with a more messed up union than it is now. And that means basically evolving from, you know, a scenario in which we have coalitions of the willing or support to single member states to truly supranational. And I know this word is not very, you know, appealing in Washington, D.C., but truly supranational instruments. Believe it or not, that's the answer. It's not easy, but if we continue doing the same things we have done in the past 15 years, it won't work. Yeah. The second problem is about comprehensive and inclusive efforts. So we need to be comprehensive in the efforts we do to solve crises in the neighborhood and beyond. And we need to be inclusive with our societies. You have heard it. And that requires resources and requires broader coordination between states in Europe. And it is all about creating new social bonds. New social bonds. We can't afford having banlieues, having the Europe of banlieues for the next 15 years. And we can't afford having instability in our neighborhood at the very community level. These societies must become peaceful. And then the third issue is global dimension. So it's no longer about just discussing, national instruments. We know nation states alone can't do much. Okay, we know that. We've been discussing that for 10 years. Europe, the European Union alone, won't be able to solve this, to fix this. We need deeper cooperation with partners. And here, obviously, it was mentioned, as was mentioned before, engaging with the United States, with Russia, with local actors, with the Gulf states, and with Turkey. It won't be easy, but that's the only way to actually tackle regional problems, which otherwise Europe alone, or the United States alone, or even both the transatlantic link between Europe and the United States won't be able to tackle. So, in this sense, really think global and find our raison d'etre as a force for good and for good change. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And our fourth panelist, I'd like to turn the floor over now to Dr. Matteo Garavoglia.
Hi there. Bad luck to be the last one when you get tiramisu in front of you. I like to be entertaining to keep you awake. Full disclosure, I'm going to say some things that I mentioned yesterday at Brookings. There's a person sitting here that was there yesterday. Apologies, the drinks will be on me next time. She knows who she is. Okay, I'd like to talk about Europe in the sense that these days, for me, it is rather, I wouldn't say silly, but limited. We cannot talk about Italy without talking about Europe. We cannot think in terms of nation state without thinking about the European dimension. And more specifically, I'd like to talk about two Europe that are out there. This is something that I think is often misunderstood or probably not well explained from the European side here in the US. We face a situation whereby we have to deal with two Europe all the time across policy areas. And this is one of the underlying reasons why we underperform in terms of policymaking as Europeans. Now I'm going to talk about three brief dichotomies that have to do with these two Europe. A geographic one, an institutional one, and one in terms of answers. First one, the geographic dichotomy. In Europe, we have today a situation where some member states have an open arms policy, have been welcoming refugees and migrants. Two countries that stand out there are Germany and Sweden. Germany, in absolute terms, is taking in more migrants and asylum seekers than anybody else in absolute terms. In relative terms, Sweden is taking in even more people as a percentage of the population. So these countries have decided, these member states of the European Union have decided to go for an open arms approach. Okay. On the other hand, still talking about geography, if we look at some other countries, I'm thinking about Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, the Czech Republic, there the answer has been the other way around. Nope, I'm going to close borders, keep them out, don't want them, with even some rather unappealing manifestations in that respect. You had the Czech president a couple of days ago going to a rally against refugees. You have high-ranking officials in Poland saying that refugees bring in diseases that are not harmful to their bodies, but they are harmful to our bodies as Europeans. You have Hungary building borders and walls and fences, quite literally, and they've been extremely effective at it. No migrants getting to Hungary anymore, because they are physically stopped from doing so, therefore breaching the principle of non-refoulement, basic principles in international humanitarian law that guarantees for everybody the opportunity to lodge an asylum application once you cross an international border, and so on. So two very different Europe here, and we have to be aware of that. That's one. Then we have two Europe in institutional terms. When we talk about Europe, that means everything and nothing, frankly. We have European institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Council, Brussels, and we have the member states, national governments, Rome, Berlin, Paris, London, and all that. Now, the problem there at the institutional level is that we see a pattern in this policy area, as well as in too many other policy areas, whereby European institutions in Brussels, and when it comes down to migrants and refugees, I'm talking especially about the Commission, whereby these institutions are ahead of the curve by saying, hey, we have a problem, let's come out with comprehensive pan-European solutions to this problem. On the other hand, you have member states, find the brakes, saying, yes, but, no, we want to do it this way here in this country, this other country will do this way. Result, no action. Now let me give you a couple of practical examples. Let's talk about money, and let's talk about the operational side of things. Let me bring this up. Okay. In terms of money, there's a set of funds that the European Union has been putting together over the last couple of months since the 23rd of September. There's a Africa Trust Fund, there's a Syria Trust Fund, and there's a humanitarian aid trust fund that the European Union has been trying to put together to tackle some of these issues. We're talking about 5.6 billion euros, that comes to that $6 billion. Could be more, but not too bad. It is some cash. The idea, the general praxis, the general modus operandi is that EU institutions come up with half of the cash through the EU budget, and the other half is provided by the member states, by national governments. Okay, good. So we're 2 months down the line. There was an agreement to tackle these issues. And what happens? We have a situation whereby the European Commission came up, it has pledged, it has the cash, 2.8 billion euros, 50%, its share. It is there on the plate. The member states, they came up with just over 500 million euros, a shortfall of over 2 billion. So again, they took a commitment, they pledged to do something, they don't do it. This is the money bit. Now, let's look at the operational side. We have a bunch of agencies, we love agencies, we have agencies for everything. You guys are quite hardcore on that here as well. And 2 agencies that are busy with all this are Frontex and European Asylum Support Office. Frontex is, you could think of it as an embryo of a pan-European border agency. It is not that much yet, but it tries to coordinate securing borders. It's a coordination agency of sorts. And the other one that I just mentioned is an agency that is supposed to cooperate and support member states in their asylum policies and processing asylum seekers, for instance. When hell broke loose, they said, hey, we need more support because we cannot support the member states in return. We don't have the resources. So 23rd of September, again, there's a deal, and we say, well, these agencies altogether asked for just over 1,000 new officers and experts that they could then redeploy across Europe to help the member states dealing with these issues. 23rd of September, we're 2 months down the line. They've asked for just over 1,000 officers. How many did they get? Just over 500. 2 months? How long do we have to wait? Again, the member states don't deliver. Final bit there, and I think that is the fun trivia fact. After a lot of fuff, there was an agreement to relocate 160,000 migrants that have reached European shores, primarily from Italy and Greece, to other member states of the European Union. Therefore, to share the burden in a way, say, hey, let's make sure that we all as Europeans take care of people and spread the effort. That's 160,000 people. Okay, not so many when you think that we expect in 2015 to have about 1.6 million people coming to Europe as migrants or refugees, so 10 times more. So we're talking about 10% of the problem, which is not a problem, of the challenge. Okay, let's do that. Let's relocate these people. This relocation process has started 2 months ago. It is going so fast that at the current pace, we'll be done relocating these 160,000 people. Again, 10% of the people that will come just in 2015, by the year 2101. That is a bit too slow. All right. Again, because the member states are not doing silly things, such as providing the airplanes to fly these people from Greece to France. So this is the institutional dichotomy. We spoke about 2 Europe, a geographic dichotomy, an institutional dichotomy between the European institutions in Brussels and the member states, and I put the blame squarely on the member states. And for once, Italy, which I'm not great fan of when it comes to politics, has been doing far more than many other member states. And finally, I want to just wrap up looking at the dichotomy in terms of possible answers that we have out there. We have public opinion, governments, and so on that say, hey, here it is, all about securing borders. Close down borders, that's it. Migrants just cannot come in. Okay, that's one way to go about it. And then you have the other approach. It's all about having a European approach and welcome everybody. Okay, let's look at that. Now, these are 2 extreme ways to go about a challenge that actually has to encompass as in terms of answers, both elements. You cannot welcome people properly if you don't secure borders. But if you just secure borders, the problem doesn't go away. It just comes under different shapes and forms. So I do not know what the answer will be. What I do think is that this answer will have to bring in these 2 elements. We'll need to get better securing borders. We'll need to actually come up with a common approach in terms of asylum and refugee policy. And I ended on this note. What we have now in the pipeline are 2 proposals being drafted by the Commission, again, so European institutions, you see that again. On the one hand, to establish a common European Coast Guard and a common European border force, effectively the Europeanization of borders and security along borders. Proposals are in the pipeline that will come out probably in January on this front. And a bit later, within the first 6 months of 2016, proposals to overhaul, change, rejuvenate the Dublin Convention, that is a set of regulations that make up asylum and refugee policy in Europe, so as to develop a truly pan-European framework when it comes down to asylum and refugee policies, so as to work as Europeans. Both these proposals are coming primarily from the Commission. I have some hope. I also have some fears, and the fear is because of the member states. My fear is that once more they will apply the brakes and not move on this. We'll see. I'll leave it there, but I want to apply this. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for the very rich presentations. I'll turn to Mark first to see how we are on time, how we want to handle the comment and Q&A.
Well, we've committed to 1:30. We got about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. So what I propose to do is take several questions at once and ask you to focus your questions so we can get to them, and we'll open the floor now. So, please go ahead.
I have 2 questions actually. One is around the issue of 17 years is a sobering number in terms of the amount of time that these individuals are staying in refugee camps. And I know that we've been talking specifically about the issue here in the United States and then in Europe. What is the Arab world itself doing in terms of resettlement? And it's one of those issues that keeps coming up in the media here. And from my own experiences, I believe the only country that has resettled refugees in the past is Jordan, in terms of Palestinians that were given dual nationality. So I'm just curious what's happening there, and I think I'd be curious who could answer that question. And then a broader question for the Europeans in terms of the assimilation process in Europe. Is this an unfortunate group, or is this a systemic problem in terms of how Europe is assimilating refugees? And obviously, are there examples? Can we learn from the mistakes or the things that you're doing right here in the United States?
Great. Okay. Other questions? If not, we'll turn to our panelists to respond to that. Jessica, I don't know if you want to talk about the Arab response, but if others want to chime in, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Sorry, I can't.
It's okay. No, don't worry.
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because we talk about the kind of wave of refugees hitting Europe, but the vast majority of refugees in the Middle East are in neighboring countries to their home countries. So per capita, the country in the world with the most refugees is Lebanon. Right now, there's one in every 4 people in Lebanon is a refugee, which is just an overwhelming number in relative terms for any government to deal with. It's particularly difficult for the Lebanese government, which many of us know does not work particularly well under the best circumstances. In Jordan, right now, the 4th largest city in all of Jordan is the Zaatari refugee camp. Turkey has around, I think, 800,000 refugees, but don't quote me on that one. But they're staying close to home, and so regional countries are very much doing their part. Kuwait has, for the last 5 years, hosted a UN pledging conference for refugees. They're setting up their own, Gulf states are setting up refugee camps that are independently funded, because they find it faster to do that than going via the UN refugee system. So there's a lot going on in the region, but it's really a team effort. This isn't something that we can just say, well, it's the region's problem, because it's clearly an international problem.
I'll turn to Matteo, and then we'll work our way down this way.
Okay, so
I'll
stand up so I can see you. Just a couple of points on that, on both questions. On the Middle Eastern front, there is correct 100,000 roughly in Turkey officially. Unofficially and not in camps, we are closer to 2.5 million. Okay, that's on the Turkey front. Jordan, 1 in 4. That is as if the United States were to have about 80 million refugees. That's a lot to take. Then we have Jordan, again, refugees that have been there for a very long time, and then the Palestinian territories. That's a bit of a different ballgame. Things are as bad to the extent that we have now know of just short of 300,000 Syrians that are fleeing Syria and seeking refugee status in Iraq. That gives you an idea of how bad things must be, right? On top of it, just to complete on the thing on the Middle East, you have certain countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and so on that officially they are not part of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Therefore, they are not part to all that. So they are not supposed to contribute the same way that other countries around the world are supposed to contribute. Yet informally, they are doing things. For instance, they are renewing continuously work permits for people from the region that are not refugees, but effectively by keep working in Saudi Arabia, you stay out of trouble. That's the Middle Eastern bit. On the European side, in terms of integration policies, again, I don't think we can talk about Europe there. You have completely different integration policies across Europe. 2-3 models, very briefly. You have the British one, French one. These are countries of long-term integration, long-term migration. Also, careful there. We should be careful not to mix migration with those people seeking asylum status and refugee status. Different things. On the French side, the model has always been assimilation, pretty much. You sign up to the values of the Republic, and the values are very much secular values. So religion stays out of public life. In the UK, on the other hand, you are allowed to a certain extent to bring in, to a significant extent, to bring in much more also your cultural dimension, religious values, and so on into public life. So it's not assimilation as such, it's much more multicultural in that respect. Germany, another ball game, because you had Gastarbeiter, former migrants from Turkey, incidentally, primarily, that went to work to Germany over the years. Now you have a very different type of migration to Germany these days. Italy, on the other hand, is a country that used to be a country of migrants and became a country of immigration over the last 20 to 30 years. So the policies are still, I wouldn't say in the making, but it's all new stuff. So there's not an answer there. We would have to look at different policy areas within each member state and see what we can learn. Yeah, okay.
Ambassador.
Yes, thank you. I would beef up a bit on the Italian side. Well, first of all, we don't have a policy of assimilation. We have pretty much a policy of integration. There was, in the previous government, we had a dedicated minister for integration. And when Congressman Cicilline was talking about what the US is doing to integrate refugees, well, it reminded me a lot of what we are doing, because we also have a package for each refugee that should let them in 3 months, so 3 to 6 months, let's say, to learn the language, at least the beginning of the language, and also to acquire some sort of capability for a job, so that they become independent. As for Syrians, you know that they are very special refugees because they are highly educated most of the time, and also they have some means, so integration is quite easy. But on the rest, yeah, for us it's very important to keep freedom of religion and all these kind of values, so we don't try to assimilate whoever comes in our country.
Giovanni.
Thank you. On the learning, I like this quote from Barack Obama's book, Dreams from My Father, where he defines law as memory. The law also records long-running conversation in nation arguing with its conscience. So I think what we have learned pretty straightforward, is that we do boots on the ground, doesn't work. We do no-fly zones, doesn't work. Military operations alone, however we set them up, don't work. The single most important lessons that both United States and Europe and European countries should learn is that we find ourselves with the difficult task to set up new, very complex forms of engagement now, multidimensional, not just taking into account the military side, but taking care of civilian side, taking care of good governance, taking care of the civil society, taking care of creating the conditions for growth. This now has become paramount, all important. If we don't, and this paradigm shift has been there for a while, but if we don't start implementing it now, it won't change.
All right, I think with that, we will wrap it up. We've had a very broad discussion here. We talked about the political, the humanitarian, the security implications, in particular the crisis in Syria. But as was pointed out, not all migrants are coming from Syria and from many other places. In other words, these are problems that are not going away, and that we, the United States and Europe, will have to work together to address them. So I want to thank our panelists, also thank the National Italian American Foundation, and Mark, I'll give you the mic back to close things out.
Yeah. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time today to come, especially Jeffrey for being here to moderate. The challenge that we have with distinguished members of Congress when they join us is that when the issue is one that they're passionate about, we tend to elaborate a little bit more than you might expect on the front end. I'll kind of leave that at that. But again, thank you to our distinguished panel, Jeffrey, to you as well. And that concludes today's public policy luncheon. You'll hear more about our next luncheon in the very near future. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for watching, guys.